Throughout this course, we've looked at many different kinds of nanomaterials. And all of the materials we looked at were man-made materials. This could lead you to think of nanotechnology as something that humans invented. Well, that's not the case, and nature is even better at making nanomaterials than we are. What we'll find out is that nature can make nanomachines that are far more advanced than those that have been generated artificially. In this lecture, we'll look at a series of natural nanomaterials and nanomachines, and I think this will really give you an appreciation for the role of nanotechnology in nature. But so you're calibrated, let's start by looking at a few examples of nanomachines that humans have created. We've not yet talked about nanomachines, and this may have been something that you thought would actually take up much of the course. If you are familiar with Michael Crichton's book, Prey, you may be especially curious to hear about nanoscale robots, a type of nanomachine he describes in that book. The nanobots in that book are pretty nasty, and they're intent on taking over the world. Now, you haven't seen anything remotely similar to this, and that's because no one has ever made a nanorobot. This is a long way off and perhaps even impossible. So let's begin with a look at some nanoscale machines that humans have created and consider their abilities and limitations. Before we do, let's stop and think for a minute about what machines in general actually do. They typically convert one kind of energy into another. For example, many machines convert electrical or chemical energy into another type of energy or force. Movement is one way that this conversion is manifested. And then we have to be clever about what to do with the movement. For a car, it's pretty straightforward. We convert chemical energy, a force that propels the car forward by causing an axle to turn and with the two wheels attached. In a sewing machine, a needle moves up and down in response to consuming electrical energy. So in order to call something a machine, there really needs to be some kind of movement. Let's look at a pretty simple example of a nanomachine. This is a nanoscale motor that is made from a collection of fancy organic molecules. It has different domains that link two ends, and there's a chain in between. And then there's actually a ring threaded onto the structure. When an electron is removed from the complex, this changes the charge on part of the change, and in response, the ring moves from one site to another. So this is the idea behind making a simple nanomachine. We can use an external stimulus to create motion that could hopefully be harnessed to do some kind of useful work. Another very neat example of a nanomachine is the nanodragster. This was built at Rice University and uses carbon fullerenes as wheels. If we zoom in on the molecular structure, we can see that it has two large fullerenes at the back and then two smaller ones at the front. So the overall structure is actually like a nanodragster. The researchers who built this were able to get it to zoom around on a flat substrate, but in order to get the dragster to move, they had to heat it up to about 200 degrees. So this nanomachine is functional, but it uses lots of energy, kind of like a real dragster. And using thermal energy as fuel is not very practical. And there haven't yet been any breakthroughs that allow the nanodragster to power itself like a real car with chemical fuel, but there's lots of effort that is being invested in reaching this goal. Now, here's an example of a nanomachine that can use chemical energy. It's a nanorod that is half platinum and half silver. If you give this nanorod a solution of peroxide, it zooms around like a rocket. What's happening is that the gold portion is reacting with the peroxide to generate oxygen. The presence of the oxygen then helps the rod to zoom around. They are pretty fast, so the first nanorods that were engineered to do this could travel a distance 10 times their length in under a minute. A next generation version that contains more efficient catalysts travels 100 lengths in a second. The first model of this type that was generated had completely random movement, but eventually ways to control its movement were developed. A magnetic field could be used to orient the rods and get them going in one direction. Using a concentration gradient of fuel was also an effective way to control the movement of these nanorods. The gradient was produced by making a solution with different levels of fuel in different spots of the tank. The nanorods would then orient themselves to travel up a concentration gradient of fuel, and eventually they would congregate at the source of the fuel. Eventually, the same system was shown to be able to carry small cargoes around. A switching mechanism was even built in so that they could drop off the cargo at a defined location. Another application of the nanorods involves using them for sensing. Because they speed up in the presence of certain chemicals, tracking their velocity can tell you how much of a certain substance is around. This idea was recently used to detect cancer cells. A group at the University of California in San Diego attached an antibody to the surface of the nanorod, and then they showed that the nanorod could pick up a cancer cell selectively and then carry it through solution. By watching how quickly the rod moved, they could determine whether or not cancer cells were present in a sample. Now, I could give you many more examples of early-stage nanomachines with limited functionality, but I think by now you get the picture. We are a long way off from Michael Crichton's nanorobots. What he described were nanoscale creatures that could self-replicate by injecting themselves into bacteria. Not only is this a work of fiction that shouldn't be taken too literally, there are specific reasons why what Crichton envisioned could never come to pass. Many things, including friction, scale up when you miniaturize things. This means that a tiny robot would experience much more viscous drag, and flying through the air would be more like swimming through molasses. So these nanorobots could not keep up with a human in a chase, and they would be lucky to move even 1/10 of an inch per second, making it difficult for them to even keep up with a snail. So there are obviously technical challenges with making a robot move as Crichton envisioned. As well, other properties that he gave his fictional nanomachines, like self-replication, are also extremely remote or perhaps impossible. At present, I think most people in the nanotechnology field believe that this is not necessarily where we should invest our efforts, given that we have so many important problems to solve in medicine, energy, and computing. A more realistic concern than dangerous self-replicating nanorobots are questions about which nanomaterials at what levels might become harmful to humans or to other features of the environment. For example, silver nanoparticles that kill harmful bacteria might possibly get released into the environment and kill beneficial bacteria, such as those that are used in wastewater treatment plants. Some of the metals used in nanoparticles, like cadmium, are known to be toxic, and the unfamiliar properties of some materials at the nanoscale may possibly include new forms of nano-based toxicity. Now, concerns like this are reasonable, and there are many studies that show that we need to be cautious when we scale up the manufacturing of nanomaterials, and we need to think about downstream consequences. We also need to ensure that people who work with large quantities of nanomaterials take appropriate measures to avoid inhalation or ingestion. But it is also easy to get carried away with these concerns and contemplate throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But given what I hope you've learned about the promise of the materials we've described in this course, makes that seem like something that should really be avoided. Moreover, natural nanomaterials are actually everywhere in our environment, so they're not inherently dangerous. And I think this is an important point to consider when confronting claims about the danger of nanomaterials. So let's take a look at one of the most abundant natural nanomaterials. Diatoms are a type of tiny unicellular algae that are basically everywhere. They're in fresh water, they're in seawater, they're in our soil, and even ice. They are an important part of the environment, and they handle almost half of the recycling of carbon dioxide into organic molecules. Diatoms are also an important part of the food chain, and many fish rely on them as their main food source. And they've been around for a long time, so the first fossils of diatoms date from the Jurassic period 180 million years ago. Diatoms have a fascinating structural feature, and this is why we're talking about them. They have a coat made of silica with really intricate detail. Diatoms are really the ultimate nanoengineers. They put all kinds of nanoscale features onto their shells, and these are really amazing to look at. These things come in all shapes and sizes. There are over 16,000 different species. Some of the diatoms are circular, while others are square. Here you're looking at a diatom that's actually shaped like a peanut. Diatoms very often have shells that actually have multiple layers or parts, and this one has an extra covering around its middle. These structures can be as small as 1,000 nanometers across, but what is really amazing is the detail in the diatom shell. These organisms are somehow able to make nanoscale patterns in their shells. Now, how do they do it? Well, they take in silicon from the environment in a soluble form, and then once it's inside their cells, the diatoms put silicon into tiny vesicles. Vesicles are like really small soap bubbles, and some diatoms know how to make them shaped like rods or even donuts with holes in the middle. So they put silicon into the vesicle, and then the presence of some other molecules that are around causes the silicon to form a nanoparticle, or a nanorod, or a nanodonut, depending on the shape of the vesicle. The diatom then transports the nanoshape onto its surface, and particle by particle it grows a shell. Very intricate patterns get built on the surface of the diatom. We're not exactly sure how they template the pattern, but now that the genomes of several diatoms are sequenced, we have an idea of what proteins they have in their cells, and we'll probably be able to figure this all out. We also don't know what the function of the patterns are, but it's really amazing that nature can do this kind of nanoengineering, and there is undoubtedly more to learn. Another very interesting aspect of these organisms is how diatoms reproduce. They have to have some way of getting out of their shell if they're going to have any chance of reproducing. And we know that given their abundance, that they must be really good at replicating. It turns out that their shell actually has two parts that fit together, kind of like a petri dish. Sometimes there's a strip wound around the middle. We saw an example of one of these a few minutes ago, and this strip can help hold the two pieces together. Now, keep in mind that diatoms are just single cells, so they divide in order to reproduce. The two cells end up getting made inside of the silicon capsules, and then as they grow, they push the two parts of the shell apart. Eventually, the parts of the shell separate, and then each diatom grows the part of the shell that is missing. And I think it's very neat that they can reproduce this over and over again. So nanotechnology researchers are inspired by how good diatoms are at making nanomaterials, and they're also dreaming up new ways to use diatoms for different applications. For example, a group of researchers in Oregon figured out how to substitute titanium for the silicon in diatoms. They grew diatoms in the lab in reactors that contained a soluble form of titanium, and when they were done, they were able to determine that the diatoms were about 2% titanium. Now, this may not seem like much, but it should be enough to give these diatoms special properties. Titanium dioxide, unlike silicon dioxide, can be used for hydrogen production or solar energy conversion. So by manipulating the composition of the diatom shells, we may be able to use them to produce energy in new ways. There are also organisms in nature that are very good at producing a different type of nanomaterial, magnetic nanoparticles. There are certain types of bacteria that make these particles and keep them within their cells. It's not completely clear what the bacteria use the magnets for, but it does mean that they always stay aligned with the magnetic fields that surround the Earth. You're looking at a picture of a bacterium called Magnetospirillum, and you can see that it has a chain of tiny particles running along its side. The presence of these magnetic particles was discovered relatively recently. It was 1975 when the bacterium and its particles were discovered in shallow pond water. The scientists that were studying them observed that when they took a solution of bacteria out of a pond and they put it on a microscope slide, the bacteria would all line up on one side of the slide. And they originally thought that bacteria were navigating towards light. Bacteria sometimes do this to stay close to the surface of water because the oxygen concentrations are usually higher there. But the scientists eventually realized that they were responding to a magnetic field, a really interesting property, an unprecedented property for a bacterium to have. Birds have a more obvious use for magnetic particles. You may have heard about this. Birds can use internal magnets to help them navigate when they're migrating. The Earth has a defined magnetic field that varies in strength according to where on Earth a bird is. So then the magnetic particles that they carry can give them navigational information. So let's take a closer look at these particles and how they get made. The magnetic particles that are found in birds, and also the bacteria we just talked about, are made of a material composed of iron and oxygen. It's called magnetite, and it's very common. Magnetite has a metallic black color, and it's found in a crystalline form. We think that in nature, the magnetite particles get made in the same way as the silica nanoparticles we just talked about. The iron is processed inside of a vesicle, and then a particle is formed. The locations of these particles have been studied in great depth in homing pigeons, who are obviously really good at finding specific locations. These pigeons have a set of 3 neurons that have magnetite particles within them. Now, we actually don't know how birds transduce the information coming from these particles, but we do know that the magnetic particles help them figure out whether they're pointing north or south. We think that birds use this information not only to make sure that they're pointed in the right direction, but also to know where to stop for food. A study done a few years ago showed that nightingales that were exposed to the same magnetic field as they would experience in northern Egypt would eat more and really try to bulk up a bit. Northern Egypt, it turns out, is an important stopping point for these birds. And it's one of the last places that they can stop before they have to cross the Saharan desert. Birds are really smart about not loading themselves down with too much body fat, but to make it across this desert, they usually need to gain about 3 grams of fat. This is the same amount they gained when they were exposed to this magnetic field. So there seems to be a strong link here. Some kind of signal is being transmitted to the neurons that are in contact with these nanoparticles. It's really amazing that these nightingales and other birds have evolved to use nanomaterials as a homing system. Now, let's look at one last example of a natural nanomaterial. We've all marveled at the beautiful colors in butterfly wings and the intricacy of the patterns that different butterflies have. Beyond being nice to look at, these patterns are actually really important for the mating of butterflies and the ways that they recognize one another. And it turns out that what determines the shape of the pattern and the actual colors that show up on butterfly wings is the nanostructuring of their wing scales. If we zoom in on the wing of this butterfly, and this is a butterfly called a juniper hairstreak, we see a very complex pattern. And there are structures there, if we really zoom in with fine resolution, we can see structures that are about 2,000 nanometers. But you can see that there are even finer nanostructures underneath them that are about 100 nanometers. And this is what actually produces the light green color on a butterfly's wings. Small changes in the spacing or the shape of the pattern will cause the wing to reflect a different color. So this type of nanopatterning, which can be controlled very finely, is used to create very intricate designs on butterfly wings. You've probably also seen iridescent beetles and other brightly colored bugs. Now, what's behind the actual colors that we see? Colors can come from a variety of different effects. So they can be the result of interference, like when we see colors on the surface of a soap bubble, that's coming from interference. Or color can come from diffraction. This is something that happens when a beam of light interacts with features that are really the same size as the light waves. Color can also be the result of scattering. The very blue color that we see on a blue jay results from scattering rather than the presence of actual pigments. Similarly, the color that we see on most butterfly wings comes from thin film interference, where the coloration is due to alternating layers of high and low refractive index materials. So in short, the patterns that are used to generate the interference and produce colors that we can see, all of these colors really originate at the nanoscale. So these are a few examples of nanomaterials made by living organisms that seem to be very safe and compatible with sustaining life. Now, let's turn back to the idea of machines at the nanoscale, and let's look at what kinds of machines nature has developed. Scientists are really just endlessly impressed and inspired by the intricate variety of molecular machines that nature has created. Also, nature is really good at making very efficient machines. All of the energy produced in our bodies is produced by a nanoscale machine called ATP synthase. This machine uses hydrogen atoms as fuel, and it produces a molecule called ATP, which is essential for almost all of our body's functions. ATP synthase has many different components. It's quite a complex nanomachine. But the most important component is a rotating stalk that sits in the membranes of our cells. When a hydrogen atom comes along and is taken into ATP synthase, this causes the stalk to twirl, and the protein then uses the energy created by the movement of the stalk to make a molecule of ATP. This is an incredibly efficient machine. Every hydrogen produces one molecule of ATP, and the synthase never misses. There are also nanomachines within our body that produce all of the proteins our cells need. This machinery is called the ribosome, and it's a complex of 3 very long RNA molecules and about 75 different proteins. It measures about 30 nanometers, and there are many, many copies of the ribosome throughout our cells. This image shows ribosomes lined up on a long strand of RNA. And what they're doing is that they're reading the sequence of RNA, and they're converting it into a protein sequence. This is a really amazing machine. It does this all by consuming chemical energy. A very complex set of steps is carried out by the ribosome. It first binds what's called a messenger RNA. This is a piece of RNA that is, you can think of it as a transient copy of a sequence found in the DNA genome. It's just converted into RNA. Then the ribosome recruits what are called transfer RNAs. The transfer RNAs are what match up with the sequence of the messenger RNA, and each transfer RNA has an amino acid attached. So in response to the sequence of the messenger RNA, the transfer RNAs line up, and then the ribosome zips together all the amino acids to form a protein. The function of the ribosome, a tiny nanomachine, is highly programmed and really specific. The ribosome very rarely makes a mistake, and it can't afford to, given how important our proteins are to the functions of our cells. Another very impressive natural nanomachine is made possible by a substance called actin. Actin is a protein that polymerizes and can form extended structures. This image shows the actin filaments in a cell lit up with a dye. You can see that it forms a really complex network across the cell. Actin forms a nanomachine with another protein, myosin. And this complex between actin and myosin gives our muscles the ability to move around. Myosin harvests energy from ATP to propel itself along actin filaments. This is how we get movement at the nanoscale. And this movement is translated to movement in the real world at the macroscale because our muscles have fibers in them that have lots of actin and myosin. So billions of myosin molecules consuming billions of ATP molecules is the basis for how we get around. And it's all because of the nanomachines that can get the work done. And this is a really good example of the collective impact of lots of nanomachines. We have to keep in mind that the size scale of nanomachines makes it such that for their work to be manifested in the macroscopic world, we'll probably need to put billions or trillions of them to work at once. So have we been able to reproduce artificially the functions of the kinds of natural nanomachines we've just spoken about? Not even close, unfortunately. As you've seen, we've really only been able to make machines that can move around in pretty simplistic ways. We've not yet come very close to making a machine that could actually make a product, chemical or otherwise, like the ones that natural nanomachines make all the time. On the other hand, our ability to understand and use the astonishing nanomachines provided by nature is getting better and better. The development of all the tools that nanotechnology researchers have at their disposal allows us to take a look at biology at a very detailed level and learn from it. It may be that our best bet when it comes to making nanomachines is to take what nature has come up with and figure out how to control it using the tools of nanotechnology. This is an approach that is currently being pursued to generate what are called biohybrid devices. These devices might be able to harness, for example, the contractile movement that actin and myosin can produce and control individual muscle fibers to get more controlled movement at the nanoscale than we've seen so far. I think this is a hugely promising approach that has a lot to contribute, and it may well move ahead faster than our trying to replicate or replace what nature does from scratch. This lecture is the last that will discuss the biological aspects of nanotechnology. Now, in the concluding lecture, Ted Sargent will describe another set of very exciting discoveries and developments on the horizon. I hope you now have a better appreciation for what a good nanoengineer nature is, a perspective that really ties together nicely with the previous material we covered on nanomedicine. Here we've seen that biology is really good at nanoscale engineering because all of its building blocks are nanoscale. This is the very same reason that nanotechnology is so important for medicine. In medicine, it's essential to be able to get down to the nanoscale in order to make drugs more effective, surgery more precise, and disease diagnosis more sensitive. We also know that if we want to convince cells to form tissues, we need to give them the same nanoscale clues that they get within the body. So I hope that this material has given you a clear picture of the promise of nanotechnology for important medical advances and the central role of nanomachines in nature and how the nanoscience of nature and medicine are related and will become even more interrelated in the future. And most of all, I hope you found these areas of nanotechnology as fascinating as I do.